This week, we're starting to think more about the nitty-gritty of how to write your research paper. So typically when we get to this assignment, students have a lot of nerves because so many feel as though they're bad writers. They're not, but sometimes having a game plan of how to write something makes you feel more confident. This video will review the key elements of research paper writing, giving some do's and don'ts along the way. So, if you've ever written a 5-paragraph essay, you're likely familiar with most of these structures already. But just because we know the name of something doesn't inherently mean that we know how to execute it. So as you write your research paper, you'll want to make sure you include an introduction with a thesis, body paragraphs with topic and transition sentences, a refutation or naysayer section, and a conclusion. This image comes from your textbook, They Say, I Say. It's a way to visualize what you can do to make your writing flow, which tends to be one of the areas students say they struggle with the most. So if you tend to think that your writing feels clunky or choppy, chances are you're not connecting the parts in an effective way. So you want to reach forward and reach backward to connect the parts of your writing. So imagine yourself reaching from one point to the next and bringing them together and tying them up in a nice little bow. When we do this, it creates flow and it makes for a more pleasant reading experience for our audience. They better understand what we're saying and why it's important. So there are lots of ways that you can connect the parts, and these tips come from that chapter too. So if you want more information about connecting the parts, you can read the chapter from your textbook. It's got a lot of great tips and templates. This is just a quick overview. Anytime that we can point backwards in our writing, whether using a transition term or pointing word, it helps our audience connect what we're currently saying with what we've already said. So having that continuation of ideas makes things easier to understand, and it makes your reader feel as though they have more stake in what you'll say next. So repeating key terms and phrases can help to give your writing momentum too, to compel the reader to continue, but this is something you have to be careful with. So if you engage in too much repetition, it gets stagnant and boring and your reader will stop caring. So you can avoid this problem by repeating yourself but with a difference. And you have practice with this already, like when you incorporated quotes into sentences before. So you had the introduction to the quote itself, and then you explained it. So you're doing a similar thing here. You're making a point, then repeating yourself to reiterate the point in an even clearer way. Tell us something and then explain it. When we get into writing research papers, it's important to keep our purpose in mind. We want our audience to understand something from our argument, and in most cases, you're writing a research paper to not only share what you know, but to argue your idea or your research is credible. So when we make those arguments, we want to keep our reader focused on what we're saying, not how we're saying it. And as such, following genre expectations can help with that. It can be very important, right? And intros are the first place that we can do that. So an introduction is there to grab your audience's attention, and it gives them a chance to buy in, and you want them to keep reading. So you might consider using a narrative opening or some kind of interesting statistic to get your audience's investment right away. So narrative openings can be more fictional, like imagine if. They can be anecdotal, or they can be grounded in the research you've done. So telling a story is intriguing, especially if you tell it well. Your audience is curious to see what you're going to do. So if you start with just a plain fact, it's not intriguing off the bat, right? You'll lose audience members if you start a research paper with John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. Boring, yawn. Give us something interesting instead. So immerse your reader in the experience, right? In an instant, on November 22nd, 1963, the course of United States history was changed forever with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. That's more of a story. You're leading your audience into it instead of saying something that they could read in a history textbook. The intro is also the place where you should provide your thesis and any necessary context before you get too far into the paper. So think about what terms or phrases your audience might need to know in order to understand your argument. A thesis is where you make your argument. So it's usually at the end of your introduction, and it's typically about a sentence long. In that sentence, you want to answer the questions, what is the topic, who should care, and why should they care? I had a professor in undergrad who used to make us map out how we answered each of those questions, and then we built out our thesis from that. So if that's helpful for you, feel free to use it and use those questions to guide you. You don't have to just answer, you don't want to just answer them and then copy and paste them as your thesis, and it needs a little bit more formulation than that. I always felt it boxed me in as a writer when I had to answer those specific questions. So if they're not helpful for you, you can ignore them. But know that that's the key of what we're trying to get at with your thesis. In your thesis, don't let things get blurry or lost, right? Make that clear argument and make it concise. And keep it where it needs to go, right? Not putting it where your audience expects it can cause them to get lost. So keep it at the end of the introduction. I've received a lot of questions from folks asking what they're supposed to be arguing in this paper. If you read the assignment sheet, watch the video lecture introducing it, or read the transcript of that video lecture, you'll have your answer. So your argument is based in the longevity of the theory, right? What will happen to it? Will it grow? Will it fade? What will happen? You are not, under any circumstances, arguing whether or not you agree with a theory. If you do that, your paper will be marked as incomplete. You need to make sure you are following directions. In your body paragraphs, you provide evidence and build up arguments for your readers. So they also contain topic sentences and transition sentences, and generally you want them to be between 5 and 10 sentences long, though this isn't a hard rule, it's just more generalized guidance. But each paragraph should have a clear idea, and most importantly, you need to cite any sources you reference. If you're quoting someone, cite it. If you're paraphrasing someone, cite it. If you are summarizing someone, cite it. If you reference a source in your paper, it needs to be in your works cited. If you reference something in your works cited, it needs to be somewhere in your paper. Anything otherwise is a red flag in your writing. Other things to keep in mind as you write your body paragraphs: connect the parts and don't do any of the annoying things that people do with quotes like you read about from Kyle Steadman. Refer back to that reading if you're confused as to what that means. But please, for the love of everything, include actual paragraphs in your writing. If you turn in a research paper that's 8 to 12 pages with no paragraph breaks, I will mark it as incomplete and send it back to you to redo. So paragraphs are a really easy thing to incorporate into your writing, and they make it so much more pleasant to read. Topic sentences are one of my favorite elements to write, especially one of my favorite elements to revise. So topic sentences are a major player in connecting the parts. So they work together with transition sentences, which we'll review in a moment. But when someone reads your topic sentence, they should know what you're going to talk about in the upcoming paragraph. One way to make sure that our point comes across to the reader is the first sentence of our paragraph to make it like a mini thesis, right? So you want to give yourself a purpose in writing. So for example, instead of saying the moon landing occurred on July 20th, 1969, you'd say, while most people agree that the moon landing occurred on July 20th, 1969, there is a sect of believers who think that the United States has not gone to the moon at all. You've gone from giving your audience a simple fact to giving yourself something to talk about in the paragraph with the second example. So now you've set yourself up to transition into talking about conspiracy theories surrounding our landing on the moon. You typically want to avoid opening with just a fact, or especially as Steadman noted in that reading, opening with a quote. So we need quote sandwiches. Transition sentences come at the end of your paragraph and they prepare your reader for what's coming next. So they basically summarize the paragraph and indicate what's coming next. So for instance, you might have a paragraph about speculation that theorists have about the note left before Kurt Cobain's death. And then your transition sentence could be something like, while many people espouse speculation about the alleged suicide note, officials stand firm in their assertion that Cobain's death was self-inflicted. That way, you can get into your next topic sentence about what the officials or the experts say, right? So transition sentences are where you remind your audience of what is important to take away from each paragraph. So something that I like to do after I have a draft of my paper is to check the topic and transition sentences by copying and pasting them into a separate document. So when that happens, you go from 12 pages of text to a page and a half, right? And that's much easier to sift through and revise, and it lets you see exactly how you're connecting the parts. So you can look specifically at how you're reaching forward and reaching back, and it can help to assess whether or not you're staying true to the purpose of each paragraph. When it's time for your conclusion, we're really summing everything up here and giving our audience something to take away. So a call to action can be effective, but you could also write a bookend for the introduction if you do some kind of narrative opening. This is a way to return to previous themes, which is really a way to make things feel wrapped up. Right, so this is the place to also zoom out. So you've spent the whole paper zoomed in on specific pieces of evidence or on your artifact, and so now you can zoom out and make broader connections, right? You can synthesize. What does all of this mean, or what's the effect of it? And as you write your conclusion, please don't forget to include one. I've read so many research papers where people burn themselves out with writing at the last minute and then just end it without trying to wrap anything up. And that's jarring for your reader, right? So don't do it. You should also try to avoid words like in conclusion. It weakens your writing. That's a helpful strategy when you're learning how to write longer papers like this, but at this point in your academic career, you don't need it. You don't. You know how the structure of a research paper works, and so you don't need to indicate it explicitly in that way, right? Just tell the reader what you have to say. Don't qualify it with a phrase like that. So it's not, in conclusion, many people believe that Princess Diana's death was intentional and it was indicative of a broader conspiracy. Just say what you mean, right? Your writing will be more confident that way, and we want you to appear confident in your writing. Don't forget that you also have the opportunity to earn extra credit by visiting the Writing Center. So all of the information is available in the extra credit module on Canvas, and your research paper is a great thing to bring with you to an appointment, and you could get some help with planning, getting work done, or feedback. If you've got any questions about the class, the project, or the extra credit, please let me know.